At Westview, we are responsible students.
Go Wildcats!
Good evening, everyone. I'd like to call this meeting to order tonight. As I heard our mayor say this afternoon, and also heard our chairwoman of the Johnson County Commission, it's a great day in the Olathe School District. And if you have not already heard, there was quite an announcement today between our city, our county, the Kansas Bioscience and Technology Commission, and Kansas State University at Northwest High School today about some collaborative partnership efforts that are going on there that I think is great possibilities for this school district. So it's a great day in the Olathe School District. Mrs. Carpenter, will you please call the roll?
Ms. Ashley? Here. Mr. Churchman?
Here.
Dr. Drummond? Mr. Gilmore?
Here.
Mr. Parker?
Here.
Mr. Poland?
Here.
Mrs. Wilhelm?
All right, we have a quorum present. Dr. Raw, would you like to introduce our guests for the Pledge of Allegiance?
Yes, I would love to introduce our guests. Tonight we have two students who are both from Bentwood Elementary School that have participated in our summer school program, and they will both be in first grade. And we have Grayson Howe and Avery Poindexter, and they're going to lead us in our Pledge of Allegiance, and then afterwards I'll say a few more words about them, and then they can have their parents stand up and also their teacher who's here with them. So would you please join me in standing as they lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance? Allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America
and to the republic
for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
And first of all, I'd like to say about these two students, if you can come in a little closer to me so I can look at my notes at the same time and be close to the microphone. Both Grayson and Avery are excellent readers, and they are excellent writers, and they're also both very good math students, and that's very important. And in addition to being good scholars and students, they both won the Principals Award for demonstration of the 4 student guiding principles. And so we are very proud that they have both the character that we try to inspire in our school district as well as the academic skills that represent their class. And they were part of this kindergarten class this last year that was over 2,000 students, the largest in the history of Olathe. So we're going to get the opportunity to watch them over the next 12 years develop into graduates. So with that, do you have parents with you today? Grayson? Would you like to ask your mom and dad to stand up?
Mom and Dad, can you please come up?
And do you have a sister with you?
No one can you come up too?
And Avery?
Can Mommy and Tate please come up?
And we appreciate the efforts of the parents to be supportive of their students all throughout the year, and particularly during the summertime. And we told them that, this is always a good way for us to start our meetings, not only because saying the Pledge of Allegiance is important in starting our meetings, but secondly, when we start with students, we have a focus for the entire evening of what we're about in this school district. So thank you again for bringing your children. And then as a teacher, Ryan Stidman is here. Stidham, where are you, Ryan? You're back. Ryan is an administrative intern in our summer school program, as well as was the kindergarten teacher at Bentwood for both of these students last year. And then one other comment I'd like to make, I think both of these young people know Andrew Churchman, and who happens to be the son of Mr. Jim Churchman, our board member. So they all have a connection here, and so appreciate that. Okay. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Grayson and Avery. Thank you to your family for bringing you here tonight. Thank you very much. We'll now move to an overview of our meeting agenda tonight. And Dr. Raw, would you please walk us through that?
First of all, I would like to just make an announcement that's been in the press release as well, that we're beginning with this board meeting to conduct it in electronic format. And the value of this is, I think, great for our community. First of all, the information that the board has that's released to the press earlier in the week is now available to the entire public online. This is another way that this board is trying to make available information to our public. We're very proud of this. It also allows us to be more efficient in terms of connecting not only this agenda to other past agendas and the resources and the work that we're doing. This has been a 2-year effort. It started in 2004. I'd like to acknowledge the committee, both Betty Carpenter as clerk of the board, Deb Madden as assistant, our technology department and division that's worked hard on this, as well as Harlan Parker and Linda Wilhelm, who have been the 2 board member representatives working with us for the past couple of years to help bring us to this point that we could launch that at the beginning of our new school year, which is always July. And this is our organizational meeting tonight, and so we'll proceed. We'll begin the meeting with our election of the president for 2006-07. We will follow that by election of vice president and other various appointments. Presentations tonight, there will be 2 presentations. The first one will be on the introduction of using the balanced scorecard as a tool to make us more data-driven in our decisions, and again, providing more information over time to our Board of Education and public. The second presentation will be additional steps in our budget development process for 2006-07. This is something we've been working on since last fall, and we have the school year approaching rapidly. At 7 o'clock, we will take public comments this evening. Following public comments, the board will address the consent agenda. The agenda items represent matters that the board may approve without detailed discussion. They may remove any item on the agenda for discussion or as a separate action item, and they've received that information prior to the board meeting, and the board president can describe that later. Following that, we have action on bids, contracts, and agreements, a variety of those that will be discussed later. And then other action item, including setting a number of meeting dates for the 2006-07 year, as well as appointment of board representatives to the Olathe Public Schools Foundation Board, Head Start Advisory Board, and we have tonight as an action item the naming of elementary school number 32. We have discussion tonight, potential action on a boundary adjustment for undeveloped land formerly within the Regency Place attendance area, public comments policy revision action, as well as, again, some additional meeting dates to set, particularly for August, to accomplish both a joint meeting with the City Council and the Board of Education, which will be, I think, a very positive collaborative work and partner with our city and our board as we look at opportunities and challenges for the future, and then a special meeting date in August for public budget hearing and adoption of the budgets, as well as then concluding in a special meeting at the end of the month, possibly a 2007 bond task force presentation to the Board of Education. There are additional future action items that can be described at the time that we approach those. They will not require action tonight, but again, information has been provided to the board and written reports, including calendar of events. We have a scheduled executive session that will follow our board meeting, and we'll return from executive session for adjournment. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. All, and thank you for your opening remarks about our agenda items. We are, if we looked a little dazed, we're multitasking tonight with our new laptop information and our agendas here. So thank you for your patience in advance. Next item of business, board members, is election of president for the 2006 and 07 school year, business year. And with that, the floor is open for nominations.
I would put in the nomination for president of 2006-07, Mr. Kevin Gilmore.
Second. With sympathy.
It's been moved and seconded, moved by Mr. Parker, seconded by Mr. Poland. Under any other nominations? If not, it would be appropriate for the nominations to, a motion to cease nominations.
I move that nominations cease.
Thank you, Ms. Ashley. Is there a second?
Second.
Mr. Poland, thank you. Any discussion on the motion? Mrs. Carpenter, please call the roll.
Mr. Parker?
Yes.
Mr. Poland?
Yes.
Ms. Ashley?
Yes.
Mr. Churchman?
Yes.
Mr. Gilmore?
Yes. Okay, now the next item would be a vote on this nomination. Mrs. Carpenter, will you call the roll, please?
Mr. Poland,
What, no, what are we?
This is on the nomination itself.
Two-step
It's a-
process. Close the nomination.
Guess we're doing a yes or no, Mike.
Yes.
Ms. Ashley,
Yes.
Mr. Churchman,
Yes.
Mr. Gilmore,
Yes,
Mr. Parker.
Yes.
and the motion passes. Thank you very much. Next item is the Office of Vice President for the Board for the 06-07 school year, and the floor is open for nominations.
Mr. President, I like continuity, and because of that, I do think it should, as was mentioned, but I'd mentioned this to many people years before, or months before, that I think basically we should try to elect a vice president from one of the members that we know that will be still around next year. I don't know that any of us won't be, but there's 3 members that are not up for election. Based on that, I would move to put Jim Churchman's name as a nominee.
Thank you, Mr. Poland. Are there any other nominations?
While I respect Mr. Poland's comments, I would very much like to have someone in the position of vice president who has some tenure with the board and has experienced the cycles that the Board of Education goes through on an annual basis. And for that reason, I would like to put the name of Linda Wilhelm in nomination for vice president of the board.
Thank you, Ms. Ashley. Are there any other nominations? Hearing none, a motion would be in order to cease nominations.
So moved.
Second?
It's been moved and seconded to cease the nominations. Mrs. Carpenter?
Ms. Ashley,
Yes.
Mr. Churchman,
Yes.
Mr. Gilmore,
Yes.
Mr. Parker,
Yes.
Mr. Poland.
Yes.
The nominations are ceased. To my understanding, now since we have 2 nominees, that Mrs. Carpenter will record a vote, and I ask you to speak the name of the nominee who you wish to vote for. Mrs. Carpenter?
Mr. Churchman,
Linda Wilhelm.
Mr. Gilmore,
Linda Wilhelm?
Mr. Parker,
Linda Wilhelm.
Mr. Poland,
Jim Churchman.
Ms. Ashley,
Linda Wilhelm.
Okay, thank you very much. Based on the results of the voting, Linda Wilhelm will serve as our vice president for this school year. Thank you very much. Item 1.06 are a number of other various appointments, annual appointments that we make. Do we have any questions or comments on any of those? If not, we can entertain a motion to approve all of them as presented to us in our materials.
So moved.
Second?
It's been moved by Mr. Poland and seconded by Ms. Ashley. Any further discussion? Mrs. Carpenter?
Mr. Gilmore,
Yes.
Mr. Parker,
Yes.
Mr. Poland,
Yes.
Ms. Ashley,
Yes.
Mr. Churchman.
Yes.
And the motion carries. Moving on to information and presentation items, item 2.01 on the balanced scorecard. Dr. All, would you wish to make some opening remarks?
We have with us this evening Dr. Gary George and Dr. Bev Graham, who have been providing leadership and assistance on this project. Again, this was an effort we began a couple of years ago. Staff has been working particularly intensively this year to bring forth this particular tool to collect data, set target goals, and benchmark against other key performers of like organizations. And this tool, I think, is something that we can be very proud of. What you have before you is a work in progress. This is an opportunity for the board to also give some additional input, whether it's this evening or you have other ideas. So this is an awareness piece as we move forward. But this is something that high-performing organizations have a tendency to use as a tool. We think that we're on the right track here. And again, providing information both for our decision makers internally, but also for awareness of others. So with that, Dr. George, I'll let you begin.
Okay, thank you. The balanced scorecard is something that is new to many organizations and certainly new to many school districts. For a number of years, the Quality Council has reviewed data, but it wasn't necessarily as systematic as perhaps it could have been. And in 04-05, we developed a balanced scorecard. And at the time, we felt pretty good about it, but in hindsight, we realized that it was sort of okay. We went through a cycle of improvement, and this year we have been working on a balanced scorecard that is, we think, a significant step forward. And I want to thank our senior leadership team for all of their work on this, because it is a task that many people have been involved in, and it should be very helpful. The scorecard this year is now aligned with our 5 strategic goals. And so this gives us an opportunity to look at measures in our 5 strategic areas. And so that represents another step forward to get the scorecard aligned with our strategic goals. At this time, I'd like to introduce Bev Graham, our data analyst, and who helps us with a lot of this work. And Bev has done a lot of work with the scorecard, and give her an opportunity to talk to you about it a little bit, and then I'll come back and finish up. Welcome.
Thank you. Part of the process for getting the scorecard to where it is was identifying comparative benchmarks and performance targets. Comparative benchmarks just give us best practice, who has the best practice in processes and gets the best results. The benchmarks that you see were gathered from a lot of sources, from local school districts, statewide aggregate measures, a benchmarking group of 6 school districts that we work with that provide data to us, previous Malcolm Baldrige Award winners, other sectors such as business and healthcare, and research journals. The performance targets reflect the desired results we hope to achieve, and you'll see that on the very right-hand column in the target. Most of these targets were set by either a division that's directly tied to the performance measure or by a multi-divisional team that's working on a cross goal. Our goal in the long run as we finish up the scorecard is to project those targets out to 2010, to have those measures that far out. The color coding on the scorecard that you see is shaded only for the most recent data point. It compares our results to either the highest benchmark that we could find or either our target, if that's the highest that we could find. We were the highest in the area. Green indicates that we have beat the benchmark or the target. No shading indicates that we haven't met the target yet, but we're less than 4 points below it. Yellow indicates that we are 5 points below the benchmark or target. And red indicates that we are 6 points or more below the benchmark or target. This draft balanced scorecard is definitely a work in progress. It will continue to improve as we identify appropriate measures and more efficient data collection systems. This change management tool will move us toward further data-driven decision-making processes and really clarify the link between our strategies and our results. The balanced scorecard will be regularly reviewed by senior leadership. It will be disseminated to divisions for departmental strategic planning and presented to the Board of Education on a periodic basis. Dr. George?
Can you clarify what a periodic basis is, just out of my own curiosity?
That will be up to you, yet to be determined.
We've discussed, as we're learning as we're going along, I think that for some of this data that might not change except over either a semi-annual or annual time, some of it may be quarterly. I'm thinking that at least as a minimum 4 times a year we would take a look at this. It might be part of just written information to the board, not necessarily attached to any particular immediate issue that we're dealing with, but for monitoring purposes and opportunities for the board to ask clarifying questions. So, and if we need it more frequently, we can do that as well.
Yeah, because this is a great document, and particularly I'd like to see us spend time this year really understanding the action plans behind the reading assessments and the math assessments and what kinds of things are taking place there. So I certainly commend the staff for the advancements made on this document.
Finally, the scorecard, as Bev has explained, is a draft. It is a work in progress. We're interested in your input, and if you do have suggestions or ideas or thoughts, please convey those to us, and we'll see what can be done. But we're pleased to present this to you this evening. It is a first step, and we think we've made some progress over where we've been in the past, and we're happy to share it with you.
Dr. George, the other point that I would find of interest is just a continued affirmation as to how we've arrived at the target goals that we have. So we can understand what I know there's been a tremendous amount of planning and thinking that's gone behind those, but just so we can understand them.
Okay, I think in terms of some of the goals, we've set those based looking at what's realistic and what's feasible. In other cases, in some cases, they're definitely stretch goals. But different divisions have considered different criteria as they've looked at those goals, and we've also looked at the benchmarks, and obviously we'd like to exceed that benchmark, the best practice benchmark, so that we puts us in a better position down the road.
Good, excellent, thank you.
The last page of this document has a bunch of stuff that's been crossed out. Is that because it's been put elsewhere within the scorecard, or?
There are some issues that we run into with some accuracy of the data, and some whether it's valid and whether it really means what we think it means. And then there are some pieces that we want to take a second look at, and so we've tentatively have stricken those from at least a district level scorecard. And I might say that there are pieces of data that various divisions and departments are looking at that are far more detailed than this. But as we think about what would be appropriate at the district level, we want to make sure that it's appropriate, it's accurate, and that it does reflect district-wide issues. And so there's a little bit of work to do on some of those last couple of pages, and we'll try to get those cleaned up.
In line with Mr. Churchman's question about action plans, a lot of areas that we need to focus on. And I would be interested in prioritization, how we see ourselves prioritizing those, and which ones we see to be the most important, and which ones are we going to strive to reach first. And the action plan would indicate how we're planning on getting there, and some kind of time frame, what our expectations are in like digital classrooms. I notice that's one of the areas. There's a number of areas here that are on the scorecard, and I'd like to see each one of those with a priority, an action plan, and a timeline.
Those are pieces that we're working on, and we're trying to have a consistent format, and Bev has been working on this a great deal, a consistent format in our action plans across all divisions, and begin to move in unison toward having good written action plans in a consistent format, timelines, people responsible, et cetera. So we're moving in that direction, but right now it's not completely finalized.
And also in that same regard, maybe start listing some of the barriers and some of the challenges that we see in order for us to reach the benchmark, and what we need to do as a district in order for us to reach that.
Good point.
Okay.
Any other questions or comments? Dr. George, thank you very much. Dr. Graham, thank you. Next item 2.02, is our budget development process for this fiscal year. And Dr. All, you'd like to make some opening remarks about that as well?
First of all, I appreciate the time that Mr. Diener and others have put into this process to bring us to this point. Appreciate the board members' time, both at the meetings and individually, spending time so that we could go through information. Some of it is very detailed, so there's been a lot of homework here, a lot of preparation, a lot of thought given to this particular topic. We've actually been working on the 06-07 budget process, I think, since early last fall, so this is not, for public awareness, a sudden kind of thing that we've arrived at. And we are not yet completed, and so tonight Mr. Diener is going to present some information that hopes to summarize some of the key points of the discussion that we've had to this point. Secondly, you have, and we'll hear before you, some potential options that staff have prepared for the board's consideration. Each of those options have some key elements to them that the board can take a look at that have been put in there because those have been also discussed by individual board members or the board in its entirety. We believe that the budgeting process to date is going to address our goals. One of the things that we're already in is nearing the end of negotiations with our teachers' associations, so salaries, some of the benefits in this budget you've already approved, such as health benefits, but there are dollars in this budget to really support our certified and classified staff that are getting ready to launch an 06-07 school year. We have in this budget additional teachers for meeting AYP and helping us reach not only the minimum standards for AYP, but standard of excellence. We've got the issues taken care of in the budget of our increased costs associated with just doing business from one year to the other. And we've also built in projections for growth. And it's a very simple kind of thing. There's going to be, for sure, 500 students more this year just simply because of the graduating class leaving and the kindergarten class that we just saw represented here tonight, the Pledge of Allegiance, and another one probably coming in just like that. And some additional students that are probably coming in from a development. So growth is built into this as well. Along with that, you're going to see some future projections as far as where we think 4 years out. I commend Gary. We've been trying to work for a longer than a one-year view here a little bit tonight. I think that's a good step for the board and staff to take a little longer range planning view. And so I think that's a piece of this tonight that we probably haven't included in our budget development discussion that much in the past. So I think I want to draw the public's attention and the board's attention to that. And I think that each of the items here either slightly diminishes the mill levy or diminishes it below a small amount. So all of the options, at least that staff are presenting, have a stable or reduced mill levy reduction and still being able to meet those other needs. And then there's some discussion tonight on how we can begin preparing for a potential bond package if we need to see that in 07 or 08. So it's quite complicated. It's got a lot of parts and facets to it, but I hope that you'll see through Gary's presentation tonight that he brings some clarity to this complexity, and then I hope that would be opened up for board discussion to give staff some direction.
Dr. I'll just like to preface Mr. Diener's presentation tonight. One, Mr. Diener, you continue to provide this board with just all of the information and the different visual learning opportunities to understand this very complex budget, and I thank you for that. And I'd just like to tell the board that I think tonight as we go through this presentation, really the question that we need to answer, which is at the heart of our budget development process, is what do we as a board want the mill levy to look like once we have completed our bond offering, and I'll say potential bond offering. Do we want it to be the same as today? Do we want it to be above where it is today, or do you want it to be below today? And I don't think that we can really select any of these options or any variation to these options without having thoroughly answered that question.
Thank you, Mr. Churchman. Mr. Diener?
Ready?
The floor is yours for your presentation.
Well, I hope the one comment that Dr. All said in her preliminary comments is true, and I hope that is that after this evening there is some clarity to what we're talking about. I think the public needs to understand that there's a lot of summary that has gone into the documents that they're going to look at here. And the detail of all this work is going to show up more along the lines of the guide to the proposed budget that providing your leadership this evening that we can start creating for the August 3 meeting. And so right now, if people are planning on looking at the detailed numbers for expenditures down to the account number, that isn't going to happen. But what we're going to try to look is at the big overview picture. The other thing that I want to express is that I'm going to have a little bit different of a PowerPoint this time in light of the fact that we now have our board docs. And the information that you're going to see is in its full entirety for the public. I thought that instead of trying to summarize that even further into a few bullets on the slides, that we would actually look at the documents themselves. And I'm a little apprehensive on how that's going to work. I'm hoping that we can make that all make sense as I'm sliding around, but we're going to actually look at the documents so that the public can see the same ones tonight in the presentation that they are seeing if they are looking at the board docs on the web. So just for that information. The 5 items that we want to talk about tonight are just a quick little review of cash balance reserves, sort of where we've been, and sort of a little different perspective of a pictorial on how we're looking at that. An overview, like Dr. All said, of the operating budgets, sort of where we've been, and maybe a 4-year projection out. Looking at the options that might be available to us in creating a balanced budget for this coming year. Capital outlay is a very important component of the total budget and where we're going to be moving next year. And finally, a quick review on historical levies and sort of where we've been and where we might like to be. So starting with cash balances. Would like to start with a picture that represents all of the funds of the district, every single fund that we are legally responsible for maintaining. And I'm not going to talk about each one of them, only to say that the pie graph is depicting their budgets as far as relationships to each other. And what we'd like to point out is in the center of this might represent the cash balances. And those cash balances just simply represent that within each one of the funds, there are always going to be some cash balance reserves that we need to discuss. That little oval shape in the center then, we're going to blow up a little bit. Let's go the other direction. So first of all, if we can see a view of the whole thing, and then I'll zero in on some smaller components. I think at this view, though, I would like to point out that we have centered our discussion on 3 main categories. A category of restricted funds, those funds that, because of their very nature, are restricted to really working with the cash balances and the reserves. They are there for a planned purpose, whether it's a grant fund or whether it's bond and interest funds, which are set up and prepared for the next bond for the next bond and interest payment. Capital outlay fund is a fund that we have talked about extensively, and right now we have been working under the premise that we are having a cash balance of around 3% of fixed assets. And as fixed assets increase with the growth of our district, adding on elementary schools, junior highs, then the fixed asset amount increases, that the balance in support of that fund would increase. And finally, then the one that has had the greatest attention is the dependent funds. Those funds that are dependent on the operating funds for their very existence, for the operating costs. And in looking at this one, some of the areas that have been of importance are that we have looked at the dependent funds and categorized them recently as having 2 key components in trying to determine what those cash balances should be. One component of cash flow, simply put, that there needs to be enough reserves in there that we can maintain operations from a cash flow standpoint. And then on top of that cash flow, a contingency for those unknown issues, those unknown events that might take place from year to year, either from the state legislature or from the economy itself. Within the dependent funds, then, we can see all the different funds, the special education fund, professional development, and one of the large ones is contingency reserve. The contingency reserve is the only one that has statutory authority for having a maximum. And that statutory authority right now is 6%. And if the contingency reserve, based on the board's action on transfers at the year-end meeting in June 28th, that was set at an amount of 6%. And the reserves that are now in that fund are at a 6% level, which represents about 23% of all of the reserves that are in this dependent fund. So the contingency reserve fund should not be looked at as the only place for reserves in the dependent funds. It's just one place. The 6% has been looked at as important because of its relevance to bond ratings. And there has been discussions on how that actually impacts a credit rating from the credit services of Moody's and from Standard & Poor. But there is a belief amongst many that having the one factor that the board has control over, and that is the contingency reserves, that plays well with the service entities as far as if they see that the board with the thing that they do have control over, has maximized that out to the level that the state has said is a maximum level. With that, that represents the contingency reserve, the cash balances. Moving to the operating budget, in this particular form, and that's in its entirety, but for viewers, we probably will need to zoom in a little bit to give it a little better feel for what we're talking about. This graph is an attempt to try to show what historically the budgets have looked like, the operating budgets, and where it might move in the future. And also to give some feel for the fluctuation of those budgets as far from a percentage standpoint. So what we've tried to do, and I might go one larger, is we have looked at it from the standpoint of providing information on the base state aid, which is the base state aid per pupil, which back in 1999 was $37.70. As we look across the table, we can see how that's increased. In many years, it has not increased. For example, between 00 and 01, it maintained at $38.20. In 2002, it was the same level for 3 years. And so, you know, at some times that has changed, other times it's remained stagnant. The other line that we're going to be looking at is the line that represents all of the factors that go into the operating budget, whether that be the weighting factors for new facility, the weighting factors for how many bilingual students we have or at-risk students, the base state aid, the amount of levy, local option levy that the board has assigned in any particular year, and the other significant factor is the BOTA. And those numbers here represent what have actually occurred in the past and what we're looking at in the future. The next two lines, don't have any information from a historical perspective, but they will have more relevance when we get over here to the projection side. And those two areas represent the salaries that were moved at one point in time to capital outlay to free up some dollars for operating expenses from the instructional side. The other component is the economic development grant dealing with the sales tax issue. We've spent quite a bit of time on that in the past, but the reality is that we now have it for another 3 years, but after 3 years, according to the current law, that would sunset and it would no longer be available. And so what we're trying to do is create an opportunity for planning for that eventuality. As we move down on the graph, we look then at the total operating dollars that are available. We look at the increase from the prior year, the percentage increase, and then we're trying to put that into perspective with growth. We're providing information on student enrollment, the actual numbers of enrollment growth, which is 417, just as few as 6 years ago. Lately, we're seeing in the range of over 700, over 1,000 this last year, which represents this way back in 2000, which doesn't seem that long ago, does it? A 2.2%. And one of the things that we're trying to point out here that one of the board members suggested that we put in here, and I think it has a very relative meaning to us, and that is that although the budget in this year of 2001 increased by $8 million, going from 104 to 112 million, an $8 million increase, that represents an 8.1% increase. That's a very appropriate increase. But the reality of that is that 2.2% of that came from growth. And so of the new dollars that were available, 2.2% of that went simply because we were a growing district. We weren't stable like many of the school districts across the state of Kansas. And so not only did we have to meet ongoing needs of CPI increases with utilities and everything else, but also supporting for the new students in the classrooms and meeting the teacher needs. And so in that particular year, we had a 6% growth.
Mr. Diener, would you, just for the sake of clarification for the board here, make sure that the term growth is defined?
Okay. When we talk about growth, the only thing we're talking about is growth of enrollment. In this number up here, the 112, that has already taken in consideration any changes that were impacted by the state legislature. Changes such as increasing the base state aid from, in this case, $37.70 to $38.20, or changing the factor for at-risk, going from 7% to 9%. We're not talking about that as growth. We're talking, that is simply budget increases that are being available and afforded to school districts across the state of Kansas. And so what we're saying here is legislative action increased the budget 6% that year, or actions on the board to utilize a different level of BOTA, or a different level of local option budget. But that takes out the factor of growth, since in our school district, that's a huge component of that. Thank you. Does that help?
Very good, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so then as we move across here, we have highlighted a couple years. In 2001-02, the state legislative statute started putting special education in the operating budget, and the result of that is that it appears as though the increase was 15.3%, and it was 15.3. The reality is there was no additional dollars for students, but it did increase the operating budget. The operation opening of Olathe Northwest in 2003 increased the budget to 11%. That essentially that comes to the BOTA issue of having additional operating dollars that were made available to the district because of that opening. And as recently as 2005-06, we had an increase of 13.9%, mainly due to the intervention of the Supreme Court, of which we're anxiously awaiting for maybe some comments that they might have as early as tomorrow, possibly. We'll wait to see how that works. So with that as a background, then, we look at the projections over the next 3 years. The state legislature has given us some guidance, telling us that the base state aid is going to go up $59 per year for the next 3 years, giving us some indicators that at-risk funding will go up in each of the next 3 years. High correlation factor will remain stable. Bilingual will remain stable. New facility, stable. So all of those items taken in consideration give us these kinds of potential increases, along with the projected growth of the district, and then taking in consideration the two components of moving capital outlay maintenance salaries back into the general fund, which in essence subtracts from those available dollars, and also taking out of our ongoing cost the economic development grant, knowing that in this 4th year it will be gone, or at least sunset according to the current statute. And so in an effort to plan on this board's part to not have to deal with a $5.3 million drop in revenue in the 4th year, the concept is to sort of pace ourselves into living with fewer dollars. Putting that together, then, we see that we have a growth of 5.9, 4.6, 3.6, 2.8. That's with all the knowledge we have available to us based on legislative action at this time. Could that change? Yes, very easily. Subtracting out the projected growth that we're talking about in enrollment, we see that while we dealt with 9.8% this year, for the people in the community who are new to following the budgets in education, or for board members who have not worked with this in the past, this was a very, very good year for us. It was a year in which we have opportunities to make plans for the future, a year in which we've had opportunities for salaries and for other ongoing operations for meeting AYP and No Child Left Behind, and all those positive initiatives in the classroom. We've had that opportunity this year because of some very unique situations. As we project out and look into the 4th year, even the 3rd year, we're looking at the potential of a 0.3% increase for all utility increases, salary increases, and anything else that the district might need to maintain its services. Then backing out a little bit, what we've tried to do is graph that, and what we see here is simply, once again, for us visual learners, some way of looking at those fluctuations. Once again, this is when SPED was introduced into the operating budget. This high point occurred when Olathe Northwest came online, and this one occurred when, as we're well aware, the Supreme Court interacted in working with the state legislature to provide additional funding that is unprecedented in education funding. Mr. Parker?
Mr. Dean, I want to make sure we point out that in the 01-02 school year that 12% increase was really not any new money.
Exactly.
It was just money that was moved from special education to the general fund, so it was an exchange of funds, but it wasn't any real new dollars.
Exactly. In fact,
that's misleading.
Yeah. I probably should, update this, and I appreciate your comment, to put a dot somewhere down here that what it would have been that year if the special ed was not included there.
Exactly right.
And I can do that for moving forward.
It would have been in the less than 1% range.
Yes, I believe so. So at any rate, we'll move off of this table. We can always come back as the board might have further discussions on these topics. But just to leave the fact that right now we're sitting up here. We're sitting at a point that is at one of the high points, and we have some opportunities to maintain continuity, if at all possible. I would suggest that continuity has occurred in the past because we have not seen a large fluctuation in reducing of services. We've maintained those services and even enhanced them as we've moved along. Mr. Parker?
Again, Mr. Diener, if in the 0102 year, if that was the actual, if we had the actual percentage on that, this is the high point.
This is the high point. That's exactly right. Okay.
Mr. Diener, comment for Dr. George. One of the things that we really need to get some clarification on, we know that Bill 549 is complex, and we know it has an inflation indice in it according to the CPI, and that means different things to different people. And I think that we really need to dig deep to understand what kind of contributions from the state can be considered as contributing to that inflation check, and what kinds of things, whether it's base aid solely related, would not contribute to that inflation check, so we could have a clear understanding as to where that may come into play in this analogy here. So really, if I could summarize, I think we need to understand what impact that section of Bill 549 could potentially bring to the district.
We can check on that and get the actual text and have that for you. In the past, there's been some interest on the part of the legislature in having an adjustment for inflation for the appropriation, for the state appropriation, but not necessarily, that doesn't necessarily flow out to the school districts, but we would need to get the actual language and have that for you, and we can do that.
Yeah, and the actual language actually is fairly straightforward on the surface. But if you look, for instance, at what we're projecting here, if you subtract out the growth aspects, and we look at numbers that are in the 0.7% range to 0.3% range, et cetera, on the surface, that would immediately signify that that's well below the CPI and therefore would be the recipient of an inflation increase. But what I think we need to gain clarity on is what other kinds of contributions would the state deem to have already met that inflation obligation and therefore would not change those numbers.
We need to check with the state on that to make sure that our understanding and their understanding is the same, because there's some pieces in 549 that are 1 year only, and we don't know if they're going to continue. But if there's some growth in enrollment statewide and statewide appropriations increase, they may deem that as having met their CPI obligation, whereas that may not translate into money for us.
Exactly.
So I think we have to look real carefully at that language and then probably do a little bit more research to make sure that we all have the same understanding on that.
And what I might suggest that I think would be valuable for this board is to have a member from the Appropriations Committee come and speak to us on it and give us a presentation and just let us hear it straight from the horse's mouth, so to speak.
Okay.
Okay. I think that's a very good question, and I think one that has been discussed. One somewhat analogous situation is the state's current policy, or in the past it was 85% of funding for excess funding for special education, simply meaning that if you had excess costs and needed to transfer from the general fund to the special education fund for costs associated with providing the special ed services, the state statute requires 85%. In Olathe District schools, state funding, state aid, has only ever provided for between 50 and 60%. That sort of varies from year to year. This last year, it was increased from the 85 to the 92%, of which our portion of that went to about 62%. So sort of the same concept that the state statute talks about the state's dollars for the whole state and the percentages they talk about. How that actually comes down to what Olathe District Schools realizes is a different topic. But we can get further clarity on that.
Exactly, because if you read the bill,
yes,
5 people will come back with 5 different interpretations,
right.
And so I think it would be important for us to be able to
take a
Hear
look
it
at that.
straight from the legislative body.
Yeah, that's a good point, Mr. Churchman, but for the sake of this discussion, though, we've assumed the $59 a year flat
Yes.
in the increase in the base aid.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then on this also, Mr. Diener, what is the valuation assumption that you've made? Is it 6%?
There was not any valuation for assessed valuation on this particular graph because it doesn't have any relevance to the actual revenue. Now, on the next chart, when we start looking at some options and it impacts the mill levies, what we've looked at there is a 6% increase, yes.
Very good, thank you.
Which is a great lead-in, thank you. So as we go to our next chart, what we're looking at here are the actual options for the creation of a balanced budget for the coming year. In all the options, what we've looked at, and this is the total of what we have available to us right now for an expenditure budget. Like Dr. All suggested, we are still in negotiations with the bargaining unit to arrive at the salaries, and until that's known, it's hard to really pin down what's going to constitute almost 80% of our total budget. And so what we've tried to do is identify some key components and expenditures that are going to be part of that expenditure budget for the coming year. And we've just tried to identify them at this point in time. Another issue that we're going to be talking about is important to this paragraph here, and it talks about the whole idea that there's a tremendous discussion right now on the bond task force. In planning purposes, if we do have a bond election and it's successful, and we start having our first bond sale, and we try to minimize the interest rate on that sale, the best plan for that is that we would be able to have the first payments a year from now in the fall, which would be in September 2007. If we were to do that, this board would have to prepare for those payments in this budget because the revenue that's raised is raised during this fiscal year and will all be received by June of 2007 in anticipation of the payment in September. And so it's what we call an 18-month budget. I'm trying not to get too detailed, just pointing out that if we're going to plan for that, then we need to prepare for that. Plan for that, I guess that's...
And Mr. Dean, there are certainly very viable ways to circumvent that or to get around that, correct?
In planning for the bond and interest fund to have appropriate enough levels of cash to make those payments, there's only one way to meet that need.
Well, am I incorrect in saying there's a way to structure the bond offering that would not have that first payment due at that point in time?
I'm sorry, yes.
Okay.
There is an option that the board will have that option to, when they structure that they could tell the potential bidders that we're not going to be making payment on this for the first year, and that the first payment is going to be 12 months, 15 months out. The only concern from past advice that we've received from our financial advisors is that sometimes doesn't make the greatest scenario for the numbers of bidders for those bond sales or the rate at which they will bid. So we just have to balance that concern. But that is an option.
Yep, okay, good, thanks.
Excuse me, and Mr. Churchman, and that another option is to delay it, the bond election until a later time. So we put it in the next fiscal year.
To make it coterminous with the 18-month budget.
Can do that.
I would say...
Or have the bond election, if it's successful, but put off issuing the first bonds for long. That's another option.
Yeah. People get pretty antsy once the election has been approved and they start seeing those potential projects. But that's a very good comment.
But realistically, I think Mr. Gilmore brings up a great point to be considered because there would be that staged series of bond offering events anyway. Okay, thank you.
So what we now have are 4 options that we would like to present to the board. And we really believe, and just to tag on what Dr. All said in the introduction, we've tried hard to listen to the community, to the board, as far as what we felt was important to them to include in this budget. And we've tried very much to include all of those concepts to give the board some options to move forward. In some of these, I'm going to point out specifically some of the options right now in the beginning, but then not spend as much time on the other three options because a lot of them are repetitive. To start with, we're looking at an enrollment of 750. We're talking about using 30%, the full authority of local option budget, full authority of BOTA, moving 500,000 of the 2 million of maintenance salaries that are currently in capital outlay back to the general fund, which impacts that whole operation, and also the use of 1.3 million of one-time reserves that are currently sitting in the operating budgets. That's been a source of a lot of conversation, and we've tried to include that within this.
And Mr. Diener, just for clarification, that 1.3 million is coming out of which of the eggs?
That would come out of the egg-labeled dependent funds.
The white one?
The white one.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. As we look then at the 6 levy funds, and these really are the only levy funds that we have, what is being, this option represents is moving capital outlay to 6 mills. It was 7 mills for a couple years back in the early 2000s when the board at that time moved some costs from operations into the capital outlay. And in an effort to still sustain those costs, those expenditures, and also maintain the normal operations of capital outlay, that levy was moved up to 7 to balance that out at that time. The last 2 years, because of pressures of other factors on the total mill levy of the district, the board chose to back that 7 mills off to 5 mills. Actually, it was 4 mills 2 years ago, 5 mills this past year. And so what we're suggesting is because of a lot of discussion on needs in capital outlay, and because of a lot of discussion on bond tasks and bond projects that perhaps maybe should be in capital outlay, we're putting this at 6 mills. We're also including in the bond and interest a ½ mil increase for the potentiality of the bond election coming online and needing funding for next September. With that scenario, we would have a projected mill levy of a little over 68 mills, which would represent a small decrease in the total mill levy. This is the plan then that would, if that's important, to maintain a stable mill levy. This one meets that objective. Looking at option 2, we have something very similar, only the only change here is moving the capital outlay back to its current level of 5 mills. Takes away from some opportunities in capital projects. We're going to look at that in a slide coming up. But it does continue to plan for the bond and interest for the potentiality there. That has a total reduction of 1 mill for this following year. Option 3, no additional comments there, only saying that the capital outlay remains at 5. Only in this scenario, we take into consideration that because of all the unknowns of the bond task force, when that might occur, plus also taking consideration that there are options to work around not having funding necessary. We took that out as well, which leaves us with a 1.5 mil reduction. And the final option then talks about digging a little deeper into the reserves. And there are a couple different ways to do that, but the method that we have selected here maximizes the state aid to the Olathe District Schools, but also achieves the same objective of having additional reduction in the BOTA, which is Board of Tax Appeal dollars in support of new operating funds for new facilities. By reducing that levy, we in essence would use up some of the reserves to counterbalance the revenue flow that would be reduced. By counterbalancing that, that also has an impact of the LOB, of which I would be glad to sit down and talk with people further on, but I won't go into that at this point. Maintaining capital outlay at 5, which gives us an overall reduction of about 2.25 mils. The one issue that we need to be careful with this option is that if we do dip further into the reserves for this particular purpose, then we're dipping into ongoing costs. We're now providing for ongoing costs with one-time money, which simply means that leadership would need to start the process in the fall for identifying ways in which we could reduce costs, reduce programs and services associated with that cost, so that in the eventuality that a year from now, if we do not raise the mill levy back up to where it was, that we would then have to find a way to support programs with reduced revenue. And so that would be the one concern that we would have with that one. But
Mr. Diener,
I'll stop at this point.
I just want to comment to the board on that. First, I do want to thank you for your presentation again. I think you put some outstanding scenarios in front of us. I bristle at the fact of an insinuation of potential reductions. I think that's the wrong way to look at it. I think if we look at the history of how the district is operated with our ability to exceed growth enrollment projections, the efforts, the outstanding efforts of the district and staff to underspend our budget, and I'm not talking about 1 year, I'm talking about, let's look as far back in history as we need to, that to give a projection that would be faced with reductions, I think would put the wrong perspective in this board's eyes. And so I just ask you to keep that in the back of your mind.
Now moving to capital outlay expenditures. Once again, we've looked at a 4-year projection, and on this particular one, there's an awful lot of details here, and I'm going to even summarize this one even further than what I have earlier, although some would probably question whether I've summarized anything this evening. As we look at the information here, what we're saying here is that it's based on a 6 mil levy, make it a little larger, and this is based on a 6% assessed valuation growth. What we're trying to show here is the levy, the dollars that would be coming in to support this particular fund over a 4-year period. We've included some cash reserves here of 4.6 and 3.8 that constitute the 9.4 million that the board transferred at the end of the year to work with the cash balance reserve issues. It also has in it dollars that are increasing for economic development growth. In one slide earlier, we talked about our operating budget would be reduced because of the economic development grant being phased in. It's being reduced because the capital outlay would have additional one-time dollars to spend. And so that actually benefits this particular fund in the capital outlay fund. Working that through the whole process, and there are some details here about planned expenditures that would be available. Notice that there are some items in here that we're calling foundation equity in both technology and the service center, and essentially what those are somewhat of a reflection of the discussions in the bond task force. The whole concept that in the bond task force we've identified some facility issues and some technology issues that one could suggest should be supported with the capital outlay versus a bond, a long-term bond. And so this builds in some of those expenditures if the board were to go in that direction. At the bottom then, what we see is that there is the potential for $24 million expenditures, which would be reduced to $15 million over a 4-year plan. If we compare that type of a plan, the only thing changing is the availability of the mill levy, that being reduced to 5 mills, or I should say maintained at 5 mills. What we see is that if that was 5 mills for the duration of the 4 years, that would represent a little over $7 million fewer dollars coming into this fund to meet fewer projects. And also at a 4-year comparison, the individual years of what expenditures could be made would represent a $14 million swing in the potentiality of the 16 mills. And so I'll leave this one at that.
I just want to comment on this chart as well. I think that this chart is a great news story. It's really indicative of the fact that we have a lot of good options in front of us. And if we look at the $24 million on the table, 24.6, we've talked a lot over the last year about deferred maintenance needs and bringing equity across the district. This represents in excess of a 42% increase in what we spent over the year before. That's an outstanding situation. If we just go back and look at the last 4 years through 2003, this scenario here basically gives us a 50% increase in holistic capital outlay spending year over year. That's a good news story. That's a tribute to the district. And I think probably the best part of the story is that we can do this, and we can do a whole lot of other things as well to achieve that thing that this board has talked so much about over the past year called balance. And so I just think that we've got nothing but good news in front of us, and we have some creative avenues that we can go down and accomplish these kinds of things. I also think it makes sense to spend as much as we can, and I want to preface that, without dipping into a bond fund. The more that we can spend and not have to amortize that over time, the better off the long-term health is for this district.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. And then finally, historical mill levies. What we are showing here are mill levies since 1993, and just trying to give some perspective to the board of what the mill levies have been historically. At one point in time, and if we went back about 3 more years, we would see that this exceeded 100 mills of a point in time in our history where we had the largest mill levy in the state of Kansas. I think it's important to note that, and I'm only making an observation. We're not making any projections at this time. That would be inappropriate. But an observation that in 1997, at that point in time, we had the largest bond election we've ever had of $123 million. And we see that we were able to incorporate that into our total mill levy by actually having some reductions. Now, there are obviously some other factors that are taken in consideration there. But I think when we make a promise to the community that we're going to try our hardest to incorporate future bond elections and responsibly create mill levies that are going to work with them in a balanced way, I think that that reflects very kindly. The same is true for the $60 million bond election in 2000. $73 million in 2003 was a little different scenario. That represents a significant project in Olathe Northwest. And at one point in time, when you're building a $40 million project, and then the operations to maintain that facility, that was a little more than we could sustain by just simply having a stable mill levy. And so just to point out, I think this is a good graph to show where we've been, the attempts on staff and board's attempt to try to maintain that stability across the years. And so with that, that's the summary of the information this evening. If there's any questions the board might have, or if you want to go back to any particular slide to take a look at some further detail, we'd be glad to do that at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Diener. Floor is open for questions or comments.
I got a quick question on the 4-year capital outlay expenditure plan. If we total those dollars for 4 years, that's close to $80 million worth of capital expenditures. How many of those things, if for some reason we took option 4, how many of those items would then have to be probably included in the bond election?
The simple answer is $14 million worth. If you just looked at the difference between what could be accomplished with 6 mills and what wouldn't be accomplished with 4 mills, is the difference of $14 million.
Well, I guess my question is, are these items that the task force considered, or above and beyond what the task force considered?
Including in these items that are listed here, I think it would be a combination. Some things in capital outlay every year, for example, the microscopes and the equipment in classrooms comes out of capital outlay and not out of the operating side. So there's certain things that wouldn't reach the level that the bond task force had taken a look at that we sustain through a capital outlay mill levy every year. There are traditionally out of capital outlay the infrastructure of, let's say, our network, our system that supports payroll and accounts and whatever, and any replacement of technology we've tried to maintain out of capital outlay, and the enhancements, expanding, has typically come out of bond money. So some of these things in here would be things we would be doing with or without a bond election. Yeah. And then there are others in here, for example, the facility equity, that's $7.6 million. Those are some identified projects associated with some of our older junior high schools and older facilities, and that has surfaced in the bond task force discussion, and we could take care of some of that out of this planning. Wouldn't take care of everything, I believe, that you'll hear from the bond task force, but it starts chipping away at that. One of the nice things for next year is that there's some of those things we could start on right now, because, you know, in your earlier discussion tonight on we have to come up with a bond package, and go through that discussion. We have to set an election, and then you've set some scenarios here, some options that might further delay the selling of those bonds, which would delay, in some cases, the start of some projects. So this capital outlay plan over the next 2 years allows us to do some things of those smaller projects. I don't know if is that addressing your question, Mike?
Yes.
Okay.
You know, as we look across these 4 options, I think some other things to keep in mind is, we'll go back to December of 2005 when we heard that people like Kansas debt. We heard that again in March.
I'm sorry, Jim, I did.
People like good old Kansas debt.
Oh, okay.
We've seen that in the success of our bond offerings. I think it's important to note that these 4 scenarios, or any other version of these scenarios that we may want to have a discussion on, hasn't looked at the other egg inside the big egg, and that's the capital outlay fund of 3%. And certainly there's another opportunity to look at things that we may do, and certainly then the dependent funds, there's opportunity there as well. You know, there's differing opinions on the 6% contingency reserve. I think my mindset is that if that's important to the bond community, that's something that we should retain. That being said, I also believe for a fact that the bond community will look at the overall reserve level. They'll look at all the other attributes on that list that we received some time back. And so the whole point of that, and we heard back in December, that we would have to materially impact the cash reserves in order to alter our bond rating. And obviously materiality has different definitions for different people. But those are things that I think the board here needs to keep in mind as we evaluate which option, whether it's 1 through 4, 5, or 6, that we elect to move down the path with.
Mr. Churchman posed a question earlier in this discussion that I'd like us to talk about if we could, and that is, do we as a board have a preference for an overall mill levy? Is there, I think, Jim, you talked about, do we want it lower, do we want it the same, or do we want it higher pending a potential successful bond issue? So why don't we talk about that issue in terms of getting perspective on what we think about that?
And I think, Mr. Gilmore, I appreciate you bringing that up. It's important to put that into context. And I would say, based on calculations that a number of different factions have done, we could expect that bond election to bring with it somewhere in the 6 to 9 mil increment. I think 9 mils probably being more realistic, 8 to 9 mils. But I do want to preface that comment by saying that one of the calls I get frequently is from the public saying, it seems to me that the bond process has been decided. And it's important that the message continue to resound out to the community. No, it hasn't. Your input still matters. And I think our discussions here tonight, we need to be careful in not trying to give the signal that we're taking the ballot out of the voters' hands. But that being said, it's our task to look into the future and plan today. And I think 7 to 9 mils is probably a realistic level of what we're looking at.
Mr. Churchman, that's going to be dependent upon the size and also dependent upon amortization, how long we would decide to spread out the bond issue and the staging of the bond issue. And historically, we've always taken the position, we've tried to have as short an amortization as we could because that saves tax dollars and that saves interest expense. But in order for us to maintain, to be able to do what we want to do in the district and be able to maintain a stable mill levy, that would certainly be an option that we could go to a longer amortization schedule on it, on the bond issue or part of the bond issue. And we've refunded in the past, and that's been successful for us. So I don't know that 8 to 9 would be an accurate number because we had some other options in regards to that and how long we would amortize the bond issue.
You're absolutely right in what you're saying, and welcome if Mr. Otting would like to share any commentary, not that it's necessary, but I think there have been projections that have looked at 15 years, 20 years, 25 years, and I feel fairly confident, would welcome staff's input if I'm misstating, that we would be looking on a conservative side of 5 mils, right. But I think that realistically we're looking at 7 to 9 mils, somewhere in that neighborhood. Now, once again, that's without having made that bond finalization and looked at all the fine work that the task force is doing. But unfortunately, we're in a position here this evening where we have to make those kinds of projections. And I think that we're relatively safe in the 5 to 6 to 9 mil range.
Okay.
You want to comment on that? Or would Randy
I
like to comment?
can, if you'd like for me to.
Yeah, just-
I would only reflect back on the last 3 bond elections. And at the same time, depending upon if it's the desire of the board and the community to have a bond election in whatever range and sell the whole thing the first year, then I think realistically we would be looking at 5 to 10 mils. But that's not normally the reality, that the needs are going to be necessary the first year. And as we look at the past, in a relatively large mill levy, a large bond election in 1997, even with the 73 million, we pointed out that was 5 mils, and very easily the board could have actually increased the mill levy during these 3 years to where that levy increase was not even at the level it was of 69 mils. It very easily, our analysis back in those days could have been like 67 if we would have phased that in the 3 years prior to that. So, there's ways in which if the maximum mill levy that you might want to attain at some point, if that's the goal, then it would take some tough decisions in the out years in planning for that. But it could be planned, and you could prepare for the eventuality that I truly believe that the year that it hit, there would be very little impact on the total mill levy. I'm not talking about the mill levy for bond and interest is this next to the last one. I'm not talking about that levy. That levy may go substantially up. Right now, the board has been working on a 20 mil sort of a semi-limit. And that's a fluctuation of 5 mils right there. But the boards in the past have shown ways in which they could structure other levies, such as working with the capital outlay and other opportunities that present themselves to mitigate that impact of that one levy so that the total levy is stable. And I think that there's history that would show that that is a true statement.
That's where I wanted to get to, was to talk that I think while we have no set policy on an overall mill levy goal or target, previous boards have been operating under a stability mode. Try not to go too far up or down, or I guess too far up at one time, and try to maintain as much stability as. Mr. Parker, would you agree with that? You've been here longer than I have.
I think one of the peculiarities, if you will, about this upcoming bond issue, at least from my perspective, is that so much of what we've done in past bond issues has been for new construction. This time we're looking at a combination, or at least it appears that we might be looking at a combination of new construction and deferred maintenance. And that has the potential of, being pretty significant because we're looking at 2 different areas, and there are significant needs in both areas. The comment that Mr. Churchman made about folks saying that the bond issue has been decided, I know that we're looking at a lot of issues with this bond issue. A number of topics have been brought up, but one thing that is for certain, it appears, is that we're going to need more schools. But we also have to take care of our existing schools, and they're aging. And we have to address that and stay on target with that because of the equity issues. So we may have some difficulty in maintaining a stable mill levy based on what the needs are going to be and based on what that total bond issue is going to be. And I'm very sensitive to increases in the mill levy. I watch my tax bill just like everybody else does. But we have to be realistic in this,
Ms. Ashley, I think you're exactly right on that. That would be a different approach to a bond election, to a bond implementing the projects than what we've had in the past. Because if we're doing deferred maintenance, then it would probably be the desire to do all those identified projects as quickly as possible.
I would guess so. Yeah. Because they will just continue to deteriorate, and they'll be more expensive to address and take care of down the road.
So the pressures to do more of it quickly, earlier in that process instead of spreading it out, might be pretty great.
And I agree with what Ms. Ashley has said completely. The one caveat being that I think we can do all of that and still hold the mill levy where it needs to be. And I say that to the board.
We are approaching the time for our public comment period at 7 o'clock. So I would suggest, if the board agrees, we'll just take a break come back and have public comments, and then we'll finish this discussion right after that. Gary, if you will come back.
It'll be fine.
So let's take a 10-minute comfort break, and we'll reconvene at 7 p.m. I'd like to reconvene our meeting, please. This is our time for public comments. At each regular meeting, the board reserves limited time for individuals wishing to address the board. We request that individual speakers limit their comments to 5 minutes. The clerk will monitor the time and notify the speaker when the 5-minute time limit has expired. We ask that you please direct your comments to the entire board. If a response is appropriate, the president will respond or refer to another individual. In an effort to respect privacy, we ask that speakers refrain from discussing personal complaints involving individual staff members or students. Those speaking are advised that public comments are videotape recorded for broadcast on the district's educational access channel and audio tape recorded as a matter of public record. Individuals addressing the board should come to the podium at my right to the front of the room and state your name and your address. We have one person who has registered, Mr. Bruce, is it Drogi? Please forgive me if I've misstated your name. Would you please come forward? Please state your name and address for the record.
My name is Bruce Drogi. I live at 11465 South Pine Street. And I wanted to address the board tonight with regards to the budget approval process. It's my understanding that the role of the board is to somewhat govern and oversee the direction of the school district. And this is done through, in my mind, kind of how funds are dispersed, and in that way you somewhat direct how the school district spends their money. Over the past several years, we now find that the school district is in excellent financial shape, and to the credit of the guidance of the board and the staff members, I think that can be applauded. The concern I have is why or when the school district decided to start stockpiling the excessive cash at the expense of the taxpayers. I did a little research on the internet, and with a $172 million budget, the school district is generating, in my opinion, more money than a lot of for-profit corporations. The budget forecasted right now is going to generate around $34 million, which is 20% of the total budget. The student size is growing, but even with the school's forecasted growth rate, the property taxes are rising at about double that rate. So the revenue stream coming in is doubling the rate of the growth. If you go out to the Johnson County website, you can easily find out that the appraisal price of houses are growing at 4 to 5% over the past 4 or 5 years. The mill levy was increased, as you pointed out earlier, over 7% in '04. I believe the county approved some kind of incremental tax bill, and it was reapproved again in this current fiscal year. The housing prices are increasing. New homes are more expensive, and new homes are being built. Kind of given all these facts, I feel that it would be irresponsible for the board to approve a budget that didn't favor somewhat lowering of the mill levy. In closing, I believe the community has always supported the school systems, and to believe that if the district really needed money, it wouldn't be made available would be somewhat misleading and really without precedence. So that's my 10 cents.
Thank you, Mr. Drogi.